Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second webinar of the Navigate webinar series from the Northeast Clean Energy Council in collaboration with Clean Capital. Thank you, John, for being with us today and moderating this session dedicated to renewable energy. My name is Catarina Madeira, and I run Navigate. This webinar series has the invaluable support from all Navigate sponsors, such as the state agency NYSERDA, who works to advance energy innovation, technology, and investment in New York State. Thank you so much for your support. Before passing the word to John, I'd like to kindly remind you to stay on mute to avoid any sound problems. Please feel free to use the Q&A feature or questions feature on GoToWebinar to send questions throughout the session. And I'd like to advise you as well that at the end of the session, you'll receive a very short survey. Thank you for completing it and sharing your feedback with us. And tweet with us throughout the webinar using the hashtag NECEC and the handle CleanCapital_. And now it is my pleasure to hand over to John Powers, Clean Capital co-founder and president. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Katarina. Thank you everyone for joining us today. This webinar today is also going to be recorded as part of the Expert Only podcast, which focuses on the intersection of energy, innovation, and finance. Really excited today as we're with the topic of renewable energy opportunities for the next decade. Our webinar will focus on the future of renewable energy, highlighting technological advancements, innovation opportunities, policy changes, other things that are going to really catalyze the growth and continue to sort of transform our energy sources. What I really want to do is explore the future of what the next decade looks like, but also step back and look at the last decade and look at the just incredible growth we've had. And we're lucky to have amazing panelists who have deep expertise and are working for really incredible companies working to change the face of our energy mixture here in the United States. The last decade was remarkable. It was game-changing. 10 years for the renewable energy industry. It went from it being a nascent alternative energy to a mainstream energy, and in many areas, the cheapest cost of power. The US has twice the renewable power generating capacity today compared to a decade ago. And for instance, there's 80 times more solar capacity online today than at the start of the last decade. You know, and many of us do this because we want to help address the climate crisis. And, you know, some numbers really show the progress we're making. Coal went from meeting 45% of the US demand in 2010 to just over 20%, 23% in 2019. The carbon intensity of the power sector continues to decline. The last decade, it fell over nearly 25%. We still have a ton of work to do. And I do want to look forward at the future here, but I do want to step back with our guests and look back, have them highlight a little bit of work they've done in the industry, and you know how they sort of seen the growth of the space. So I'm going to first start with Doran Hole, who is the Senior Vice President and Chief Financial Officer at Ameresco. Doran, you've got a deep history in the industry. You're now working for one of the most respected public firms in the space. Can you first talk a little bit about your background and how have you seen the industry change in the last 10 years?
Sure thing. Thank you, John. Thanks for having me, and thanks everybody for joining. So, you know, my interest in the renewable energy industry started probably right around 10 years ago. In 2010, I was working for Deutsche Bank. We were starting to pitch debt service and tax equity with respect to large utility scale projects. And I do recall one opportunity in particular that SunPower was pushing at the time in Southern California as being kind of what kicked it off. And from there, I just became fascinated with the potential for deployment especially in the solar space, seeing SunPower, seeing SunEdison, seeing Sunrun, Vivint, all these residential solar companies, SolarCity start to, you know, proliferate, start using structured credit techniques that we were working on, such as securitization, and realizing that there was a tremendous amount of potential for cleaning basically cleaning the grid. And so in 2015, I decided to step out of the banking industry and move directly into industry. So I spent a few years working directly in solar on the development side. That was all both in the kind of CFO role as well as a CEO role, most recently at Renesola in North America. Joined Ameresco about 1 year ago and saw there an opportunity to really see a company that was a leader in energy efficiency and quickly expanding in renewable energy across a number of technologies, not just solar, but also combined heat and power, renewable natural gas, and within the energy efficiency space, seeing it deploy technologies as an independent integrator into any number of basic energy efficiency measures, boilers, chillers, HVAC systems, all the way to LED lighting, controls, microgrids, battery storage, solar. Taking this energy efficiency concept and using the financial that have been enabled out there, especially energy savings, performance contracting, energy savings agreements, to help kind of really expand and help customers offset their carbon footprint and save money. That's Ameresco itself is a leading energy efficiency solutions provider. Probably 1,000+ employees. We're spread across the country and 70+ offices operating in the U.S. and Canada and the U.K. and peripherally in a couple of other places in Europe. We're tracking carbon footprint with over 11 million metric tons of CO2 in 2019. I think across our projects and our projects that we're installing on behalf of customers, as well as the energy assets that we own. We're owning and operating approximately 250 megawatts worth of plants. So that's a mixture of landfill gas going direct use, landfill gas going into electricity, solar, a little bit of battery storage standalone, as well as a good bit of renewable natural gas. So very, very exciting time for the company as we see the market opportunity growing across all of the advanced technologies, smart buildings, again, more demand and a potential expansion in renewable natural gas. And then the battery storage and microgrid opportunity, the resiliency opportunities, we think are quite strong.
Fascinating. Look forward to coming and talking more about sort of the next phase of that. And I want to go next to Noah Shaw. Noah's a partner and co-chair of the renewable energy practice at Hodgson Russ, based here in New York. But Noah and I have a long track record. We both worked in the Obama administration, and Noah later went to serve in the Cuomo administration. Noah, you've seen the good that the government can do in this space, helping to catalyze the market and really helping it grow. Talk a little bit about your experience in the public policy space and sort of the role of sort of policy of the last 10 years to help the market grow.
Thanks, John, and thanks for the invitation to be here. And it's great to talk to everybody. When I joined the Obama administration in 2012, I actually joined the Department of Energy because in part because I had a background in government investigations. And there was a little company called Solyndra that was having some problems in California and a couple others. I came from Mintz Levin, which many of you are I'm sure, well familiar with. But over time, especially after I got to know Richard Kaufman reasonably well, who was senior advisor to the Secretary for Finance, I started to move into more of the actual implementation work, working with the Loan Programs Office, working with the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, working with the Domestic Policy Council and CEQ and others to put together the Climate Action Plan. When I think, John, you and I ended up in conference rooms in EEOB a few times together on that one. And it became very clear to me that this was a train that was on tracks that people really couldn't even fathom the potential of. So when I got the opportunity to come up to NYSERDA and be general counsel, where I was general counsel from 2014 through last year, I actually walked out the door just as the governor was signing the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which is sort of the signature climate law for New York State.
Just dropping the mic when you walked out the door.
Yeah, well, I had, my role was the lawyer role, but
Right.
it was a great time to leave. And you could, over the course of that period of time, the trajectory and the cost declines and the technology advances and the business model maturation that you saw frankly outstripped anything that anybody could have predicted. And in particular, you look at the cost curves related to offshore wind, or you look at where utility scale solar is and what's happened with utility scale solar, even in a place like New York over the course of the last couple or 3 years. I think it puts a lens on what's going to happen in the next decade, sort of in a place where the unpredictability should be welcome. I mean, as we were writing the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act and talking about, 85% greenhouse gas reduction by middle of the century and 100% clean energy in New York State by 2040, there were a lot of naysayers out there who said, that's not feasible. How could you possibly write something into law that, where the technology, just doesn't get us there right now? And I think the answer to that is, unless you put those markers down and unless you have faith in the advancement of technology, which we should have faith in, because it's exceeded our expectations year over year, every year for the last 10 or 15 years. You're not making good policy. So what I see coming up and what we at Hodgson Russ do, Hodgson Russ is a New York-based firm, but we also have offices in Toronto and down in Florida, and Albany and New York City. I'm sitting in the office in Saratoga Springs right now. Buffalo, yep, the flagship in
Center
Buffalo.
Of the universe, yeah.
We represent a broad spectrum of both government and developers and investors looking to acquire, looking to build, looking to understand the regulatory framework within various different markets, bulk storage, distributed solar, utility scale solar, onshore wind, offshore wind. In fact, I'm happy to be able to say today that we were just engaged by the state of Maryland to help them update their regulatory structure for their offshore wind program to get to their goals under their recent legislation, the Clean Energy Jobs Act in Maryland from last year. So we're across the spectrum. We've got a great team that's dedicated solely to renewable energy, plus regulatory and transactional issues, plus all the folks who support us in the real estate shop and the environmental shop and the litigation shop when that is needed. Because building a project, as everybody knows, is a multifaceted exercise. So throughout that, you sort of get the aperture of the perspective of the kinds of technologies that are needed and which ones are headed in which directions is becoming more clear and less clear all at the same time, right? Like we know which models really work now, but we also know which technologies aren't quite mature enough. Let's say long duration storage. Let's say a lot of grid tech and transmission technology, certain floating offshore wind. Those are the sorts of technologies that, as they mature, are going to open up whole new markets and whole new sets of sort of opportunities over the course of not only the 2020s but also, frankly, the 2030s, because a lot of our view for a lot of the progressive states' goals is more 2040, right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to focus on this next decade, because I think because the goals are 2040, 2050, whether it be some of the progressive states or, you have some states going 100% renewables in those windows, we won't get there unless we chop wood here the next 10 years and continue to sort of scale at the rate we're doing it. I want to go to our next panelist and, look back at the last 10 years and so the next 10 years for a second about really opportunity in this space. Zoe and I have been working together for a long time. When I was at the White House, Zoe actually interned for me at CEQ before going on and creating an incredible career and becoming part of Clean Capital later. And Zoe, you're first of all, Zoe's the VP of Asset Management here for the team at Clean Capital. You're an emerging leader in the industry. You've been in the policy space, now the sort of the finance space. Now you're managing almost 200 megawatts of distributed energy systems. How have things changed for folks looking to get into the industry? Starting, looking back to where you were, coming out of college to an internship, did you ever imagine sort of what this space could look like today? And then what advice do you give folks looking to get into the sort of the next iteration of the industry?
Yeah, thanks, John. So I think it's interesting, and this will come as no surprise to folks, that in 2012, when I was working at CEQ under the Obama administration, it was just a very different landscape when it came to policy and the support that the renewable industry and clean energy as a whole was receiving. At CEQ, we were working on a whole host of executive orders and the CAFE standards that were so impactful. After CEQ, I worked at the Business Council for Sustainable Energy. That was almost, during my tenure there, was almost solely focused on the Clean Power Plan. and the Paris Agreement, neither of which are in play any longer in this country. But what's interesting is that while policy is so incredibly important, I think the markets and the private sector have really spoken on this, and they haven't really skipped a beat. Larry Fink at BlackRock's letter at the beginning of this year, stating that that he sees the climate crisis as reshaping finance as we know it and continuing to do so for the foreseeable future, I think sort of sums it up very well. And I think, Clean Capital has also kind of was started on that with that mission of bringing more investments into the clean energy space at large. So as John mentioned, I'm involved, the New York chapter leader for RISE, which is the Women in Renewable Industries and Sustainable Energy group, as well as involved with CELI, the Clean Energy Leadership Institute. So I'm sort of constantly having conversations with young professionals looking to get into this space. And it's interesting that even just 10 years ago, I think, folks are thinking about it in such a more holistic lens. I think, policy, innovation, technology, finance are all part of school programs now, whereas it used to just be policy, or you were in engineering, or you were in finance. And I think where all of those are coming together is just incredibly impactful for the industry. And I think we'll see that shaping in the coming years. I'll also add, I think there is, especially given the current, current events going on, I think there's going to be a larger push to increase diversity in the energy and finance industries and clean energy finance as well, where those overlap. I think we could have an entire series of webinars on the benefits that will bring to the industry as well. And I think young folks are really thinking about that, and that climate change isn't just about about climate change. There's environmental justice aspects as well that I think folks getting into the industry are more focused on than previous. So I think we'll see that kind of being a larger part of the conversation as well. And I'll add, I think now there is a whole new set of challenges for the industry. We have an aging renewables fleet where we're seeing conversations about repowering popping up left and right that wasn't really a conversation a few years ago. Clean Capital now has, as John mentioned, over $500 million in assets under management, 184 megawatts across 124 projects, and we're thinking very critically on how we get the most out of those facilities, and how we can, I guess also harness the better technologies going forward and increase efficiency is along the way.
Excellent, thank you. And we'll dive more into that in a little bit. And then finally, Jason Kaplan's the Chief Operating Officer for Power Market Solutions. But Jason, you've got a sort of an immense background in the space and decided to go into one of the most exciting sort of emerging markets. We're here around community solar. Before diving into power markets and community solar, can you talk a little bit about your background and sort of why you decided to enter the fray in the community solar space? Jason, I don't think we can hear you.
I was on mute. That's why. See, I'm already doing the casual, what happened on the Zoom call. No, listen, super excited to be here. Thanks, John, and thanks for everybody for joining. Yeah, my road to power market is definitely a windy one. I really kind of wanted to be in this industry really because my background, I graduated from Vermont Law School and with a degree in environmental law and policy, and I wanted to affect change, right? I came out sort of bright eyes in 2008, 2009, and there was then no opportunity for young lawyers to do that effect change. Fortunately, I landed in a law firm that was doing some environmental law, but it was really around kind of Superfund litigation. For those who are not familiar with Superfund litigation, essentially I was helping a client fight for who should pay for the cleanup of a contaminated property. Really, these things can go on for years, and that was not the kind of a change that I was hoping to affect. And I really wanted to kind of push my career into renewable energy, because really that's where I felt like the development of these clean energy assets would be of the greatest benefit to us as a society and to really kind of clean our grid. I found my way to a small startup company called United Wind, which we were developing small wind energy turbines really up in upstate New York. And I really got trial by fire working for a developer, really in kind of a nascent technology, one that frankly distributed wind is sort of, I would say, the redheaded stepchild of the renewable energy industry. But nevertheless, we were able to secure financing with the New York Green Bank, with developing over 100 small wind turbines across upstate New York. And I got that experience that I'd never had before in understanding the risks and challenges there is in developing renewable energy assets in New York, but certainly, broadly. I came to Power Market really through a connection I made through the Clean Start program, which is a program that is an NYU certificate program in renewable energy, but also facilitated and sponsored through the Urban Future Lab, which I also have to give many props to the Urban Future Lab, Pat Sappinsley, their executive director, and Joe Silver and Giro and the team there, because frankly, they have enabled the growth of clean energy in the state through the incubation of some of the most prominent clean energy startups. I love working in the clean energy, the clean tech, the clean startup world. My wife might disagree in terms of the high risk, high reward elements to it. But fortunately, I found my way to Power Market really through those connections. The Urban Future Lab is sponsored from NYSERDA and National Grid, and they do a tremendous job there to support these young clean energy companies that are coming to help solve some of the biggest challenges. And so certainly anyone who on this call or the webinar who's a young clean energy entrepreneur and maybe one person or a team of three or so and want to kind of get the support and kind of be a part of a community, certainly look at the Urban Future Lab, and feel free to connect with me after this to give you some intros there as well. But frankly, through that, they've helped. Power Market was a resident of the Urban Future Lab for I think now it was 4 years, maybe 5 years. They've been a little longer than typically companies are, but we just loved working there because everybody was fantastic and they supported us. Power Market as a company, we are a turnkey servicer of community solar projects throughout the country, wherever really community solar exists. We provide services of the subscriber acquisition, education, enrollment, billing, and support for those who are developing and owning community solar assets, whether that be third-party developers, energy retailers, and even utilities. Some of our earliest clients at Power Market, and this is going on, 5 years we've been a part of this industry, were the likes of Rocky Mountain Power and Detroit Edison that were building out kind of in these regulated utility markets a product to offer community solar to their customers. No doubt over the last 3 or so years, the market has really been driven by third-party developers, independent developers of these assets, for which we're working very closely with the most prominent really in the state of New York and broadly. Right now we're working in 9 states. We've got 150 megawatts of community solar under management. And just last year we provided kind of, over $3 million worth of billing to community solar subscribers, through our portfolio. And it's no doubt a market, as you kind of indicated, John, that is really in its infancy, but it's really on the precipice of explosion, and really looking forward to kind of talking more about the work that we do at Power Market and really the community solar market generally.
Yeah, I mean, community solar is a great example of something I think if you went back and interviewed someone in 2010, wasn't even on people's radars as an idea, and it could be really a game changer here in the next decade. And I'm going to use that to sort of transition into the sort of there's a series of rounds of questions for the audience. The first I'm going to talk a little bit about policy, and then sort of corporate demand and demand that's been changing out there, and a couple other sort of key topics. If you have questions, please put them into the question feed, and we'll get to them as we go. But I'm going to keep the mic as a moderator here in the beginning and sort of dive into the first round, which I do want to focus on policy. And Noah, you've been living in the federal, we have the last few years been living in sort of a federal policy drought around energy policy, right? After there was extensive movement in the first half of the decade to get things moving, but the market continues to grow and projects continue to be built and we continue to scale. What do you sort of see from the federal, what do you see as sort of the federal role in policy here for the next 10 years as we sort of work towards 2030?
Well, that's a big question. I'll probably cheat a little bit. I'll probably cheat a little bit and just pick a few things that I think are really important. One is we have to get the standalone storage tax credit figured out. Like the fact that standalone storage is not eligible for an ITC is ridiculous, and that needs to be fixed. I remember when I was at NYSERDA, we actually did as part of our sort of state advocacy, we did a calculation of the sort of the savings to ratepayers to reach the goal versus how that bill was scored, and it wasn't even close. I mean, it was so clearly a value to ratepayers, not to mention the industry, that there just aren't a lot of good rationales, frankly, for not moving forward with that, especially as storage becomes, and potentially long duration storage becomes so much more important to the grid. And to the next item, which I'll talk about, which is fixing sort of the FERC Order 1000 transmission policy, not to mention the MOPR and other sort of wholesale market issues that have thrown a lot of uncertainty and complexity into folks' long-term cost curves and revenue predictions. I don't know that the industry necessarily needs every little ask that it throws up on the board, but it does need certainty. It does need at least the hope of consistency between and among jurisdictions, if not between zones. I mean, even within the NYISO, there are different rules that apply in different zones. That sort of the rationalization and the reformation of the FERC sort of position with respect to renewables or other asset resources that receive state subsidies, I think, is absolutely essential for scaling of especially storage and the next technology that I'll talk about, which is offshore wind. Offshore wind also is right now without much support from a tax policy point of view. That credit needs to be re-upped in part and in large part because not only is there an extraordinary potential of that industry to support the decarbonization of the grids up and down the East Coast, and frankly on the West Coast once floating technology is economic, but the economic development and jobs potential of that industry frankly makes everything else that we're doing look like tiddlywinks. You're talking thousands and thousands and thousands of jobs for each project where the average salaries are in the six figures. You're talking about supply chains into the if we reach the goals between the East Coast states, over $100 billion, and companies from all over the world looking to make the East Coast sort of the hub of that industry for decades to come. So those sort of items, I think, from the federal level, tax policy with respect to storage and offshore wind, and bringing some rational decision-making and consistency to the FERC with respect to both transmission and the ability of renewable resources to clear in the capacity markets, I think are sort of the first and most important things to do. And I have no doubt that if there is I have no doubt that if there is a change in the administration this winter, those items will be at the top of the list of the people who are tackling this stuff in the White House and the agencies involved.
Excellent. Now, Doran, Ameresco's got an extensive national footprint. You guys are playing in, I'm not sure in all 50 states, but a majority of them, right? And you guys have seen firsthand the importance of the state roles in developing these markets, but it makes it challenging because you're sort of managing 50 different fiefdoms and understanding the roles of policy and net metering or permitting or whatever in those states. First, talk a little bit about the roles of states sort of in the next decade, and then, are there specifically like any emerging markets that you're excited about at the state level that, you guys really see sort of opportunities to scale in?
Sure. So I think I mentioned it in my opening comments. We have about 70 offices around the country, and we feel like that local presence is what makes a huge difference in terms of our ability to navigate all of the local needs, whether it be permitting or interconnection rules or simply contracting environment, because we are, especially in the energy efficiency space, our core customer base is quite a lot of government customers, federal government, municipalities, states, et cetera. The state governments themselves do have a role in terms of leading the charge for what incentives and where dollars need to be going in terms of greening their own economies. And as a result, we do spend quite a bit of time with state governments. We've, of course, since the early years of the company, when it was founded in 2000, have been following this, energy savings performance contracting framework, which is a financing tool to allow customers to finance their energy efficiency projects using the savings that will be generated in the future as measured by an audit of the energy systems. That is something that is enabled by state legislation in a number of places, and the federal government has its own kind of set of rules as it relates to that. I think the states also continue to be important in terms of setting out the frameworks for renewable goals. And for example, the low carbon fuel standard in California has been an important player in the development of renewable natural gas and will continue to be. You see Oregon starting to talk about implementing something like that. You see, in fact, north of the border, I believe a couple of the provinces in Canada considering similar things. So I think those state incentives are quite important. I would, however, go back to the fact that like getting things done in these markets really requires local presence and local people who are members of the community. They are connected, whether it be politically or just environmentally, being stewards of their own communities. Those are really important characteristics of being able to carry out what it is we collectively as an industry are trying to do. In terms of specific markets, so we have deep involvement in local policy making, sort of, I guess, committees, some of the industry groups, especially in the Northeast. Of course, the company founded in Massachusetts, so the Northeast and New England are big parts of our overall market.
Is your biggest footprint in Boston?
Go ahead.
Is Ameros
biggest office is in Boston.
Yeah.
Our office is outside of Boston. We've for years done energy efficiency and renewable energy installations, both solar, landfill, and traditional energy efficiency, and some of the advanced technology energy efficiency projects for a number of municipalities, hospital systems, universities, et cetera, in the state. And that's not alone though. We are a regionally managed company, so whether we're developing renewable energy projects to put on our balance sheet and sell the power, or sell the renewable natural gas, or we're doing an energy efficiency project for a particular client, those projects, those opportunities are effectively originated by the same kind of groups of origination and sales people that we have spread around the country. And so it's kind of a collective, regionally managed group of sales folks. And I think it's important to manage the company that way, because the technical expertise also needs to be local. Understanding how to engineer projects in Southern California is very different than the design and engineering of a similar project in the Northeast.
Right. And imagine
market-wise,
how to get your permit moving through a certain utility is a lot different in a place like Colorado than in New York, than Massachusetts, and whatever.
Of course, and as we all know, you're not going to send a guy with a Boston accent out to a town hall in the Midwest to try to get a permit.
Not a Patriots jersey.
We've probably all experienced that in one way or another. We do see opportunities across the board in multiple markets. There isn't any particular region. We see opportunities for additional energy efficiency, renewable energy. It's still in Massachusetts, as they've been a very forward-thinking state. New York, especially, as our cooperation with Power Markets is coming to fruition. There's a variety of other states that we think are a good opportunity.
Excellent, thanks, Doran. And so I'm gonna skip ahead of technology here in a second, because we're getting a lot of questions about technology from folks. But before doing that, I think it's, we'd be short-sighted if we don't talk about community solar as a policy and the important role that it has both in helping to grow the marketplace, but also providing opportunity to all different levels of the social economic community get involved in clean energy for the first time. Jason, can you talk a little bit about, first of all, explain to people that may not know, what is community solar? How is it sort of viewed in these different states? How's it sort of coming together? And then with that, I do want to hit a little bit on the topic of sort of that creating opportunity for all to be part of the clean energy space.
Yeah. So community solar really is sort of the pure sense of democratization of participation in clean energy. Most people, from, a residential mass market perspective, when they think about clean energy, they think about the big wind turbines or large solar projects or even solar on a roof. But no doubt that excludes everybody who either is a renter or a student, maybe the pitch of the roof isn't right, maybe the roof's shaded, but they still obviously are really eager to participate in our clean energy future. And so how can they possibly do that? We always think what's the thing I can do to really affect change and be a part of that? Community solar really is that answer, because really the only, not all the only, but one of the fundamental eligibility criteria is that you have a utility account. Most people do. And what community solar is that you would sign up to be a participant in a community solar project, which is a larger solar project, between 500 kW to 5 megawatts. That's a project that's installed somewhere within your utility territory. So if you live in, Manhattan, there may be a 2 megawatt solar array located in Westchester within the Con Ed service territory. And theoretically, you'd go to powermarket.io/marketplace, and you'd find all the different community solar projects that may be located in that utility territory for which you live. And you can click and learn that really by signing up, by putting in your basic information, your name, email, address, utility account number, some other details, and signing what we call a subscription agreement, you can join a community solar project without any installation on your property, without any disruption. And the fundamental value proposition to community solar is that once you're enrolled on the project, essentially that solar array is being developed and constructed. You have no obligation to do anything. You don't have to maintain it. You don't have to worry about it. But once that project is operational and putting in clean energy into the grid, your utility will be applying credits onto your utility bill commensurate with your participation. And when I say participation, we call it sort of the allocation that you have to a project. And what companies like Power Market does is that when you initially apply to join one of our community solar projects, we'll look at your last 12 months of energy usage to see, based on how much energy you use, how much of that solar array should we apply as a credit to your bill. And so really is kind of where we talk about, the nuances between different states, because community solar fundamentally is a state-enabled program. The legislative bodies in New York and Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Maryland, New Jersey, wherever it is, they're sort of state-based. And so you unequivocally see differences in the way that community solar is rolled out in those states. Some of the fundamental nuances really around kind of how are community solar credits valued. In states like Massachusetts, there's sort of a fixed value that when you as a community solar developer apply and you get a statement of qualification, you get sort of a number that's, here's the value of every kilowatt hour that's going to be generated from my community solar project for the next 20 years. In states like New York, however, we have something called the value stack or the VEDR credit. And there's no doubt elements within that value stack. And trust me, I do not want to get involved in kind of going through each of those elements and how they're valued. But nevertheless,
come on, it's so fun, Jason. Only if you want to see the attendee number go way down.
Right. But nevertheless, there's variability there, and certain elements of that value stack can change over time. And so, we look at, just the way that these programs roll out. You also look at the subscriber side in terms of how should certain community solar projects be subscribed? Should be focused on commercial, subscribers. So if you look at a state like Minnesota, the way that the program was kind of built or incentivized kind of, just having a relatively small number of large commercial offtake as being kind of the participants in community solar. You look at a state like New York, however, because the value of those credits are dependent on the rate class of those off-takers, having residential rate takers and small commercial rate takers are more beneficial. And so you see much more mass market residential customers participating in community solar in New York. And so for a company like, Power Market, we need to have our finger on the pulse of how the different state policies will affect how we go about acquiring and engaging customers. Because ultimately for us, we want to optimize the value of our community solar projects for our clients. And so it's critically important that we understand all the nuances and the rules of Can we have an anchor subscriber? In New York State, you can have 40% of your community solar project taken up by one or many sort of demand meter anchor subscribers. The remaining 60% taking up small residential mass market non-demand subscribers. In Massachusetts, again, differently, you can have 50% of your project, not 40%, 50%. So really all this to say is that in different states, the rules are different. The primary fundamental nature of what community solar is, though, is the same. And from the kind of the customer, the participant perspective, in that by participating, you are supporting clean energy, you are joining a community solar project in your community, you're getting credits applied to your bill. In some states, we will charge you for the value of those credits at a discount. So you might get $100 worth of community solar credits on your bill in a month, and we'll charge you $90 for the value of that $100, thereby saving you $10 or that guaranteed 10%. Because in another month, you might get $200 worth of credits, and we'll charge you $180 for it. So you're always getting that guaranteed 10% savings. There are states, though, like Rhode Island, and soon to be New York, where the credits are being consolidated, meaning that instead of having to pay for credits, you're going to see those credits apply to your bill, and that's it. So as I said, you might get a credit for $100 right now, and we charge you $90 for it in New York. In about 9 months, you just might get a credit for $10 applied to your bill, and that's it. And so again, the beautiful thing about community solar is we're still in that infancy where the rules are changing, the policies are changing. We are very active in New York on the billing and crediting working group because no doubt even states like New York and Massachusetts, which have the most mature community solar markets, there's still opportunities to create efficiencies and to find challenges where we're operating on the ground, engaging with the individual subscribers, seeing kind of the pain points that they're feeling relative to how credits look on their utility bill, how bank credits may look, and what all even bank credits means. And so we want to make sure that community solar as a program can be optimized for kind of all stakeholders. But no doubt, each state has their own ways of kind of going about it.
So I just want one follow-up question. Actually, I'm going to put to Noah on this. Well, first of all, Jason, I'm glad you guys understand it because it sounds really confusing, and I'm glad Power Markets can help folks like Clean Capital just find those off-takers so we can just manage the projects. I know you worked on this, and this is why I'm sort of pointing in your direction. Renewables have faced criticism for not being accessible to sort of all communities of color, socioeconomic status. What role does community solar play in helping to address that, and other efforts that you've seen briefly that is helping to sort of drive that change?
I think so. When Jason was talking, I was remembering sitting in my office at the Department of Energy in 2012 or 13, and a friendly analyst from NREL, National Renewable Energy Laboratory, walking into my office, Dave Feldman, some of you may know, and saying, only about 25% of the people in the country can actually put solar on their roof. The rest is the community solar opportunity. And my mind was just like, I don't even know what this community solar is, but that is incredible. And we spent, my first interaction was fighting with the SEC, ultimately, I think successfully, to make sure that they didn't consider community solar subscriptions or interests to be securities. And then shortly after I got to NYSERDA, we got to work drafting the order that issued in middle of 2015 authorizing community solar in New York State, and I'll either take credit for or deny having authored some of those words depending on what the issue is. It is an incredibly versatile tool. That's what I'll say. I'll say that community solar by itself, just as a sort of the fundamental sort of integral model, doesn't necessarily help with the democratization and the access to renewable energy for low and moderate income or disadvantaged communities or others. You have to actually frame the rules around the model in a way and provide the incentives to the market participants to point in that direction. So in New York, obviously, we have a number of adders and other incentives that are not just for community solar, but for solar in general, that try to drive towards disadvantaged communities, try to drive towards areas that will be sort of have been historically ignored or that have been inaccessible for these purposes. But there's still a long way to go in that regard. Well, cross-utility crediting is an enormous opportunity for example, large communities downstate, as we say here in New York, who don't have access, where there's no, there's very little community solar in Con Ed, as you might expect.
Right.
Not a lot of opportunity, but if they could subscribe to facilities that were upstate, obviously that greatly expands the ability of community solar to solve some of these problems. There are definitions and questions that get super weedy really fast about what kinds of customers can qualify as either mass market or demand metered, and how those sorts of organizations can participate, or other customers can participate. There's a lot of progress that we can make there to open up community-based organizations and others who may be demand metered but who want to stay at a relatively small subscription allocation, allow them to participate at more scale. There's a lot of progress that needs to be made. I don't want to discount or otherwise minimize the incredible growth in the market, both in the states where this has been adopted. I think
Right.
the pipeline for community solar in New York State far outstrips, frankly, any other than utility scale, but any other distributed model.
Yeah, we're seeing so many.
John, I was going to jump in real quick because it's all about implementing public policy to affect that change. And so while maybe New York and Massachusetts were some of the earliest, community solar markets, you've got states like New Jersey that are really putting forth the public policy goal of inclusion of low to moderate income participants in community solar, really as a prerequisite to actually have your community solar be eligible to participate in their community solar pilot program. And so, we're involved in the New Jersey program with, some of our clients that were awarded in that first round. And really fundamentally, every developer in that award had to essentially certify that they would have 50 or more % of that community solar project taken up by members, participants of the low to moderate income community. And so that was sort of a policy directive that was implemented into the rules. And so you see that change happening. New Jersey, no doubt, a great example of that. Maryland, certainly. In Massachusetts, you've got sort of a low income adder to the extent you want to get, be incentivized to have those participants on your project. So I think we're seeing kind of that migration, that maturation of community solar policy to bring kind of what ultimately I think all of us want to have happen, is truly making community solar for all, and putting it really directly into the rules itself.
Yeah, excellent. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on customer demand, but I'm reading so many questions about technology. I'd be silly not to jump into technology, but just to make a point, I mean, we're talking a lot about supply here. One of the biggest game-changing things that have happened this last decade, and we're seeing moving forward, is the change in corporate demand when you've got significant renewable commitments by major companies that are not only helping to change the face of the projects being built, but also the policy landscape. When they can go into places like Virginia and demand they won't bring their warehouses there or their data centers unless there's clean energy. That's a factor that could be a whole conversation on itself. I do want to jump forward to technology. We have a lot of questions from folks on things like combined heat and power, on renewable natural gas, on fuel cells. Really looking at the speed and the change of technology in this last decade. It's not about the amount of efficiency the solar panels have increased in the last 10 years. It's about some unexpected changes that are outside of our ability to change, like things like the Internet of Things, and how the Internet of Things is allowing companies to manage energy as a service on a campus. Energy storage would be great, but if you can't manage the deployment of that energy storage because of the way the Internet of Things has grown, it'd be much harder to really maximize the financial impact of those deals. So I want you to think about technology for a second, and my question is going to be, and I'll start with Zoe and then sort of go around the horn. What are sort of the one or two really interesting things that you see developing and on the horizon that you think will be not just a nascent technology today, but standard practice in 2030? And I'm going to ask you, Zoe, actually, I want you to focus specifically on bringing new technologies into existing projects, right? Because we're going to have PPAs that were signed in 2010 that will be expiring in 2030, but you'll have rooftop, you'll have panels. There's really interesting things we can start to do with it. So.
No, absolutely. I think a huge piece of that is, there's a PPA that was signed 10 years ago that has a 20-year life, so we're halfway through, it's 10 years old. The landscape which that facility sits in could look very different. Utility rates have changed. Many utilities have increased demand charges while decreasing their rate for energy. So that can actually sort of skew how a PPA is then perceived, or how valuable that now 10-year-old PPA is to a rural school district in Colorado, for example. So things like being able to more easily add battery storage to that facility to lower those demand charges the game for that school. But as it stands right now, often for a small distributed system in a state that doesn't have sophisticated or ambitious battery storage policies, that battery storage addition is not really feasible as it is right now. So I think there's a lot that can be done on that front. That's not just isolated to Massachusetts and California. We have solar all across the country, and we're only going to have more. So we need those policies to sort of keep up with that, and then the lowering of how expensive the battery storage is, and having the right policies in place to add that on can help quell some of the changes that are happening on the landscape locally. So.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And Doran, Ameresco is one of the unique firms in the space because you're an integrator, right? You're not just a solar developer or a wind developer. You're doing energy efficiency, microgrids, storage. You guys are doing really amazing, complex deals. What sort of excites you? Sort of the next generation of technology that's going to help you take these projects to your customers?
So I would say the expanded deployment of storage and microgrids when combined with either combined heat or solar, and certainly there are other technologies that are going to come forward there. That in and of itself is what I see. The incorporation of resiliency is going to be a really huge piece of this puzzle. And I'd say, fast forward 10 years, you would see the proliferation of microgrids kind of throughout the country. I think a really important component of that, of course, is going to be the pace of deployment that might be driven by the incentives. Noah mentioned the ITC for batteries, but honestly, we have to get costs down. We have to get costs down to where the economics can make sense. Ameresco has had the ability to stay ahead of the technology, often by virtue of the fact that we're installing battery storage and microgrids and solar and CHP as part of a comprehensive, energy solution portfolio in it and performance contracts, which means that no particular party is relying on some variable revenue streams to support its financing. The financing is there because of an energy savings and performance contract. We have an installation in South Carolina, Parris Island, Marine Corps recruiting depot. So that just completed its first year of operations, and that microgrid with combined heat and power and solar and battery storage. And we have been able to measure out some really, really solid savings of energy and cost, of course, for the federal government. The federal government customer is not your everyday customer for the rest of the country. Right. And so we need to have those incentives in place to allow for the broad deployment. Now, moving beyond that, what do we see coming? Certainly, I think that the green hydrogen is going to be a topic of conversation going forward. We need, of course, dollars going into research and development, bring down the cost of, electrolysis, et cetera, to make that something that's actually viable. But again, when you're sitting here and looking forward 10 years, all we can talk about is what we think will move the market toward mass deployment of these technologies, right? It's our job as, I guess, combatants of, frontline combatants of climate change to, turn the theoretical into the possible. So I think we need to direct policy, and that's what will be to the forefront.
Can I ask you a question in your CFO hat? The ESP, the energy as a service, for folks that aren't familiar, the energy savings performance contract is sort of this holistic energy service contract that the federal government does, where they pay the cost and they save energy and they're allowed to do it. It really hasn't taken off in the public sector as much, or I'm sorry, the private sector as much as, for instance, PPAs, right? What do you see sort of a emerging financial tool that will allow that comprehensive, you know, for the simplest way to say it, a PPA for a microgrid or energy as a service becoming more standardized so that we can finance them to scale here the next 10 years?
It is coming, John. So where?
By the way, tell me how to do it when you're ready, because we want to finance them.
Sure you do. So where you're seeing it work for the non-municipalities, everyone can look at the C&I market and understand that, you know, their planning period, their look forward for where they're going to measure energy savings is maybe 5 to 7 years.
Right.
You know, that's why when you look at the corporate participation in the electricity market, you know, the PPAs are shorter tenor, and that's because the planning periods are shorter. So energy conservation measures actually produce good results there. Well, it's the ones that have short payback periods, like lighting.
Right.
That's where, you know, that's where it started to gain some traction. I think that the you know, when you think about some of the other energy conservation measures that say the federal government will do, you know, those things actually have much longer payback periods, and as a result of that, you know, that's a C&I market. It's hard to apply that. So the challenge we have as kind of a finance community is to come up with a product and financing sources that can look past these short-term planning periods and figure out how to customer that there is a financial benefit. And in my mind, the first two things that come to mind, first is, what is the price you can put on resiliency? And right now that's market by market. The second is
company by company.
What is the price? Right, true. And the second is, what is the price that you can put on carbon reduction? We don't have a carbon tax now, but people are publishing papers, a lot of think tanks going after trying to figure out where that sits. And I think that collectively the finance community needs to really just figure out how it likes and can underwrite the cost of carbon, convince customers that that is part of the equation that they need to be thinking of. You know, when you think about California wildfire season, you know, why companies are willing to pay for resiliency. Well, after all of the shutdowns last year, suddenly a lot of the people at companies there actually can really get down to dollars and cents of what that costs them to have no power.
Right.
I think those are the elements that need to be folded into the conversation now. So I do feel like it's coming, but as I said, shorter payback period measures, it's starting to gain traction. But for now, that tool remains popular and remains feasible in the, you know, what effectively is the MUSH market, the municipal, you know, higher ed, university market. You know, I mean, you know, the university market's taking its own turn with energy as a service. You're seeing some of these concession agreements. A large deal by Ohio State, for example, is kind of setting for future opportunities in the university space. And I think Ameresco, you know, our view is simply, look, we're going to continue to chase that market as a leading integrator of technologies. We want to be able to bring that forward, but we are going to continue to maintain relationships with financial partners to allow them to understand and underwrite the financing of those projects.
Yeah, that's great.
And again, I hate to go back to this again, but John, the numbers have to pencil for these institutions to be interested, right? And in order for the numbers to pencil, costs need to come down, and the costs come down with large deployments. And I think the United States has a choice here when it comes to manufacturing. You know, are you going to put incentives in place to allow you to be the one who can bring that low cost to battery storage, green hydrogen, whatever it is that's next, so that you don't end up where we are with solar panels today, where China rules the whole thing because the government took it and made it their own. Deployments went out the roof and costs went down.
Yeah. Fascinating. I'd add one, the cost of capital needs to keep coming down, and people are getting more familiar with these technologies the cheaper cost of capital will begin to move where there's certainty there. So the more we're proving these out, the more we're going to hopefully get pension funds and others investing in these long-term assets. So we're really short on time here, and I just wanted to, Noah and Jason, if you got a quick technology you want to reference before we wrap up. Offshore
I don't
wind?
think so.
All right.
Well, just, I mean,
prosumer.
I'll just say transportation. Obviously,
Oh, yeah.
it's that there's a lot of opportunity from a technology point of view there, and it's not even worth going much deeper. But I think in the grand scheme, that is where a lot of the action in the 2020s is going to be on the technology side.
Yeah, first of all, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I think we could do this for another hour. There's so many other topics to cover. I really wanted to thank our panelists for their insights and thank the audience for their questions. You can get more episodes of Experts Only at Clean Capital's website, cleancapital.com. Really hope to continue this conversation because, as I've said before, I think the next 10 years of this the next decade for our industry is really going to be critical so we can hit our climate goals. And, I really want to thank everyone on the panel today for their thought leadership on this and the work they're doing every day to help solve this. So thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, John.
Thank you to NECEC and Navigate for sponsoring the webinar. Katrina, I'll turn it back to you. Or not. There you go. There you go. We can't hear you. There you go.
Yeah. Thank you so much, John, Zoe, Jason, Noah, and Doran for being on the panel today. Thank you as well to our audience and of course Clean Capital and NYSERDA for making the webinar possible. And today everyone is going to receive a short survey, but very shortly we'll send additional materials about each organization represented on the call, and and then we'll work on the next super engaging webinar, and we'll share that with you for sure. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Katerina. Thank you for all the panelists. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.